You're listening to Winnipeg's Classic 107. My name is Simon Rusnak. This weekend, Winnipeg audiences have not one but two opportunities to take in the illuminating and imaginative playing of Cameron Crozman. One of the country's leading cellists, he returns to the Centennial Concert Hall to perform alongside the Winnipeg Symphony Orchestra. Joining me again this week on Winnipeg's Classic 107 is Cameron Crozman. Hello.
Hi, Simon. Thanks for having me on again.
Well, two opportunities for Winnipeg audiences to indulge in your playing and two opportunities for me to chat with you about two very different programs, right?
Yes, very different.
So tomorrow evening's concert marks your return to the WSO. You last performed with them in 2019, the Dvorak Concerto. What do you remember about that performance and about the orchestra?
I remember it being really great. I mean, it's one of these things where I believe it was in February, and so
Mhm.
I definitely was thinking in the back of my mind, Winnipeg in the middle of February, not exactly like number one destination I had in mind, but it was such a great experience to play with the orchestra. I had a lot of fun playing with them, and that was sort of interesting this year of Dvorak for me. I played Dvorak with a bunch of different orchestras across Canada, but that was definitely a highlight. It's a little cliche to say it, but the warmth of the people in Winnipeg, despite the winter, it's amazing.
Well, things will look familiar then as winter has returned here in town.
So I've
Just
heard.
just in time for your return performance. So this time around, you're tackling another cornerstone in the repertoire, the Elgar Concerto. You mentioned your relationship with the Dvorak, and I listened back to the conversation you had with us at Classic 107 in 2019, and you talked about how you knew the Dvorak Concerto intimately well. It was one of your favorite works as a young cellist, especially the third movement. And
That's
then
right.
you
Yeah.
toured it with the National Youth Orchestra when you were 17. Do you have a similar long history and relationship with the Elgar Concerto?
I do actually, but in a very different way. If I've got my timeline straight in my head, I learned Elgar before I learned Dvorak.
Hmm.
So in a way, it's an even longer history. But it's one of these pieces I just didn't find myself performing as much. I would play it for a lot of. Actually, the fourth movement of the Elgar Concerto I played for my entrance exam to the Paris Conservatory,
No way. And that
and
went well.
that worked out for me.
Yeah,
So
it did.
hopefully a good sign. Hopefully I've improved a little bit in the past, decade, but it's already a good sign. And it was a piece that I think my teacher here in Canada, Paul Pulford, had a very special relationship to as well. And actually, he just sent me because his son Isaac plays in the Winnipeg Symphony, and he just
Hmm.
sent me an email the other day saying he would be tuning in online and like sharing some of his thoughts about Elgar. So that's really cool too. I feel like the Elgar for me has a lot more of these sort of personal, close relationships, and that sort of suits this more intimate nature of the piece, I think, as well.
Yeah, I do want to talk more about the nature of the piece, and just before we get to that, I think I need to sort of address the elephant in the room, or I should say, on the airwaves more realistically. Of course, you're going to make this concerto your own when you play it with the WSO. There's no doubt about that. But it's one of those works, sort of like Gould and the Goldberg variations, where there's this one player that we most closely associate with the Elgar Concerto, and that's Jacqueline Dupre. Do you think about that at all?
Oh, totally. I mean, I think
Yeah,
it's nearly impossible not to think about it.
yeah.
And, there's this really famous sort of apocryphal quote from Rostropovich of him saying once he heard Jacqueline Dupre play the Elgar, he never wanted to touch it again. And it's true. I believe it's one of the few pieces he never recorded in his life. So it is something that weighs on us heavily as cellists, and I think it's something to take into account. And I remember I used to go to sleep listening to Dupre's Elgar,
No
so
way.
it was something that was in my mind a lot too. And as I played the piece more, it's really about sort of. I found for me the most effective is to take a very different approach from her. Her Elgar was such a passionately personal interpretation. And I think she made an amazing thing out of the piece. What I think is interesting, and fortunately for us modern cellists, is she very much did her own thing, not always what Elgar wrote in the score. And that's actually, I'm really glad she did because she created this incredible interpretation, but she's left us a lot of room to go back to what Elgar wrote and try some new things out.
If you're just tuning in, my name is Simon Rusnik. I'm chatting with Cameron Crozman, who performs the Elgar Concerto with the WSO this weekend. You mentioned a sign of the times, Jacqueline Dupre doing her own thing back in 1965, and that recording considered to be some absolute magic cut right into the record. One of the other reasons why she's very closely associated with the Elgar Concerto is she helped revive it, right? It had a less than stellar premiere back in 1919.
Yeah, exactly. And it's actually interesting. I was thinking recently, if I've got my facts straight, if it wasn't the premiere, then it was a performance shortly after, was by this cellist named Beatrice Harrison.
Huh.
And I think it is interesting how this Elgar concerto has had two women champion it actually, which I think is so unusual, particularly for for an instrument like the cello, where we don't really think of a lot of historical women cellists. But yeah, no, Dupre really brought the piece. I mean, it's definitely it's her piece, as you mentioned earlier. It's the piece that she owned, and it makes a lot of sense, her being from having that English background as well.
You're talking about the timelines and digging more into these pieces, and I know in addition to score study and practice, you've made clear you love to dive into these historical tidbits, these odd facts and details surrounding pieces. So, what else have you discovered about this Elgar concerto?
Strangely, this time I haven't been quite. It goes through phases, right? Like
Right.
there's times when I really care a lot about this sort of historical, anthropological almost side to music of like, well, where did this come from? What does it say about us and all of this? And this time I haven't done it so directly, although I have found myself almost unconscious, like not by intentional ways, but reading some English literature from Elgar's time, some works by E.M. Forster, and there's stuff by Virginia Woolf I really loved. And of course, those modernist writers, I'm not sure that Elgar and them would have really gotten along, but it does give this idea of what life was like in the day and the sort of the world that Elgar emerged out of. And that's what I've been keeping in mind. And at the same time that this is in the cello concerto, it's a very late Elgar. It's an Elgar at the end of his life, very sort of like autumnal twilight type piece. And to sort of, yeah, to think about everything that would happen afterwards in the 20th century, and that this is coming right before that, really. And so I think that's what I've been keeping in mind right now, is this is almost it's an end of an era kind of piece.
You're talking about the autumnal quality to the piece of music. It really considered to be his last major composition, and it also music that he wrote shortly after the Great War, the unimaginable horrors and carnage and loss of life, and many see that reflected in this music. It's elegiac, it's reflective. Do you feel that as a performer, as a player?
For sure, yeah. I mean, it's a fascinating psychological piece, I think, for us cellists, because especially because of this opening, which I feel like is so shocking, actually, in a way, right?
Mhm.
We have this idea of a concerto. It opens with a big tutti, and really up till the Elgar, we have a like Schumann concerto sort of starts with the cello. So it's not like he's the first person to do it, but to have this opening where the cello is pretty much playing alone, and these big chords, it's like the cello is trying to be an orchestra, and yet it's never going to be an orchestra, right? And so there's already from the very opening of this piece, this like psychological turmoil, like there is this fighting against something, and then you've got such a strange, unusual structure for a concerto, this slow first movement, which is then almost mirrored by this slow ending to the last movement, which is so surprising after this last movement that you seem like finally we've gotten somewhere. It's
Yeah,
like almost a
optimism.
march.
Optimism is
Exactly.
there. Yeah.
It's optimistic, it's energetic, it's got almost a march-like quality, and then all of a sudden it all stops, and you've got this puzzling last section that actually leads into the third movement coming back at the end, and it really asks a lot of questions. And then, of course, he just sort of slams the door shut at the end,
Yeah.
as any good concerto should. But but it is interesting how like there is this idea that it's a concerto that doesn't really want to fit into the mold of a concerto, and I think that allows for a lot of experimentation and a lot of sort of reflection.
I was reading the interview you gave with Holly Harris at the Winnipeg Free Press, and you talked about how there's sort of this sort of love story that you see in the music as well. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
It's funny because I think what I actually said to Holly, I believe that was a response to a question of sort of like what should we be listening for in this piece,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and my response was that like it's not really for me to impose, but I think there are a lot of things to see. There's this magical movement. What I think I was thinking of, and specifically when I thought of love stories, I think of this moment in the middle of the first movement where it's pretty, E minor, pretty somber opening, and then all of a sudden, with one note, it goes into the major key.
Mm.
And it's as if I always think for me, it's like remembering past love almost. But I think it's a theme. Then we get to the third movement, and it's so overwhelmingly tender. And so to me, there is maybe a theme of that. As I said, I don't like to prescribe interpretations, but it's hard not to believe something tender and intimate is going on in those moments.
It had me thinking of Elgar's love of his wife Alice, his companion, his critic, and this was at a time when Alice started to get rather ill, and she died shortly after the premiere of the cello concerto. And now I ever since I read that, and then now I've listened to the concerto again before this conversation, and I couldn't help but think of that love between those two individuals.
Yeah, and it just goes to show how, like, I think one of the incredible things about music in general, but I think particularly of this sort of era in music, is there are so many interpretations, and yet,
Mm,
like, you can sit back and you can absorb the music purely as music, right? It doesn't need to have a story
of
behind it,
course.
but it's amazing how you start to when you start to really dig into it, there's so much more meaning that we can at least, guess at behind it, and that would be surprising if that was one of the reasons for some of those moments.
Well, it surely is a very moving piece of music, and so looking forward to you performing it in Winnipeg with the WSO under the direction of Maestro Daniel Reiskin. Cameron, thanks for taking the time to chat with me again at Winnipeg's Classic 107.
It's been a pleasure.
Cameron Crozman performs with the Winnipeg Symphony Orchestra and the Elgar Concerto, plus Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, Saturday, November 20th, 7:30 p.m. at the Centennial Concert Hall. For tickets and more details, visit wso.ca.